GetsuFumaDen Undying Moon is a really cool name for a video game. I just feel like a superior man when I say it, you know? GetsuFumaDen Undying Moon. Well, anyways, that's the review. I think I saw this game marketed one time at like the back end of a digital game showcase, and I remember thinking to myself that it looked really cool, but I didn't hear anything about it after that point, which I'm surprised with because Konami actually releasing a straight up game is pretty rare these days. This is a bit of a weird one for them to have picked too. The original GetsuFumaDen was only released in Japan for the Famicom, a console that was old enough to drive by the time I was born, and it's only now getting a sequel reboot thingy released worldwide. While that original game, which is packaged in with the deluxe edition of the new game, felt like a way for Konami to ride that Castlevania high that they'd found in the previous year, GetsuFumaDen Undying Moon seems like an attempt for them to cash in on the recent roguelite craze, specifically that surrounding Dead Cells, the game's clear inspiration. It kind of feels like a complete heel turn from the original, but I guess to be fair, Dead Cells contains a ton of Metroidvania influences, so in a weird way it does all feel like it stems from the same place. But I'm not here to tell you about the full history of this series. I'm here because I got an email from Mr. Konami himself. Actually, that's not true. It was his son, Konami Jr. But I got this email that was like, hey, we noticed you like Dead Cells. Do you want to play our game? Because it's pretty similar to Dead Cells. And I took a look at it and said, alright, seems like a fun time. So thanks to Konami for providing me with the game code, but of course this video is 100% my thoughts and opinions on this title, which I guess I should get to now. Since there's a very light story here that's really not worth mentioning all that much, I'm mainly going to be talking about the game's visuals and gameplay, and let's start with the weaker of those two, gameplay. GetsuFumaDen is a pretty straightforward side-scrolling roguelite, so the main two things that we got to talk about here are the combat and the meta progression. The combat in this game is ultimately fairly enjoyable with a few different weapon types and pretty fast-paced swings, but it's held back by a few rough edges. While I wish there was a slightly expanded arsenal, what you are given here feels different and all features unique movesets, with my favorite 2 or 3 becoming pretty clear early on. Your bag of tricks is pretty standard with a double jump, dodge roll, and a light attack paired with sub-weapons that are on a cooldown, a ground pound, and a special move, which is usually some type of heavy attack that you can hold to charge, but occasionally can be a unique defensive move like a parry, which makes the katanas really unique and fun to use. You also get different variations on the special attacks depending on if you're on the ground or in the air. Admittedly, it took me a good run or two to really start enjoying the combat. At first I was worried that I'd really need to drag myself through this experience, but once I got a hold on dodge timings and lengthy windows for me to attack, it felt good. It can get pretty hack and slashy for sure, but there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you want a simple, inoffensive gameplay experience, and this game gives that to you. It's especially nice when you land a bunch of consecutive blows and stagger enemies. For me, it happened the most when I was using a dual blade weapon that hit really fast and let me pull up this spinning attack that could shred small groups, and when it happens, you pull up this massive finisher move that takes up the whole screen and feels amazing. Especially if you've done enough damage recently without getting hit to send you into your Super Saiyan phase. When the combat clicks, it's just really good fun. It's definitely not all perfect though. There's a ton of small quirks and problems that don't necessarily ruin anything for me, but are noteworthy enough to mention here. Things like your weapon range not being clear since you can hit outside of what looks to be the attack cone, or not being able to change weapons during a roll. It doesn't even get queued as an action where it changes your weapon the second that you pop out of the roll. If you press the button, nothing's gonna happen. Or the fact that you can attack in the air and right after landing, but there's this short window during the transition between jumping and landing where pressing the attack button won't do anything. Right here I was testing it out and I hit attack on landing and nothing. I guess the landing animation just doesn't have an exit state prompted by that button input. This stuff is far from the worst thing in the world, but for an action game, those little hitches can occasionally be annoying. There's also a slight problem with the readability of the action. GetsuFumaDen has a really strong visual presence in everything it does, including swinging your weapon, which gives this very defined, almost solid trail, which is cool, but it can sometimes obstruct enemy attacks, particularly with faster weapons. I found myself dodging out of the way mostly because I could guess when an enemy would probably attack me, and not necessarily because I was reading all the tells. It's all stuff that sort of doesn't matter. I got used to it and it wasn't much of an overall hassle, but considering this game wears its inspirations on its sleeves, particularly following in the footsteps of Dead Cells combat, you'd kind of wish that it would go toe-to-toe with that game mechanically, but combat's just not as tight here as it is there, even if it is enjoyable overall. I would talk about enemy variety and bosses here, but I want to save that for the presentation section, so instead let's move on to the meta progression of the game, which I describe in an eerily similar fashion to the combat. There are some really good ideas here, although ones that are explained sort of fast and in a way that might be a bit confusing, so make sure you're paying attention, but a few decisions make it feel like a step backwards from other popular titles in the genre. There's not nearly as much to upgrade or unlock here as a game like Blade Assault, but I appreciate GetsuFumaDen for keeping it simple. You can rank up your weapons during runs, which makes them more formidable, you can spend special tokens to permanently improve your base damage or attack prowess, etc. And you can use materials that you pick up from crates and enemies to unlock weapon skill trees, meaning you gain access to a few weapon buffs that you can activate in each run through a specific currency. So it's kind of a two-step weapon upgrade process that I really like. There's also other good ideas here, like being able to break down weapons that you don't want to pick up to gain a special type of crafting material that lets you unlock a super version of that weapon for future use, or my favorite, the unique stat upgrade system that's on the bottom here. How this works is you pick up these glowing blue orbs that'll light up the first of 4 potential options: main, which will improve your attack power by a slight margin. You can choose to upgrade now and receive that buff, or you can wait to pick up another orb, which takes you to the next option, sub, which boosts the attack power of your sub weapons. The next one boosts your health, and the next gives you a healing potion on the spot, so you can wait to pick up 3 orbs and upgrade your health, then maybe just grab 1 and upgrade your attack power, and then maybe you'll find yourself in a jam and hope you can find 4 of them in time to spawn a health potion. It's pretty interesting, and a lot of the core elements of this meta progression is well thought out, but again, we have stuff holding it back. Weapons you can buy from shops are almost always worse than what you're picking up naturally. Similarly, upgrading weapons can sometimes feel useless because you'll spend a bunch on that upgrade and then find superior ground loot like a second later. And worse than both of those is the fact that the system of dismantling weapons that you don't want to work towards super versions of those weapons, while making sense, means that the weapons that you unlock the fastest are the type of weapons that you use the least, the ones that you see on the ground and just go, nah, I don't really like this weapon type. I mentioned earlier that my favorite weapon was the dual blade, but not only did that seem to have one of the lowest drop rates, but when it did pop up, I'd want to keep it, so my progress towards a super dual blade was lagging behind everything else. What's definitely the worst part of upgrading though is the fact that you'll notice a couple of runs in that the amount of materials that you have at your disposal in the hub area isn't really going up. And that's because you lose those materials on death, meaning your progress between runs can come to a screeching halt. There are a few counters to this in the game, but they're not exactly the most ideal solutions. The first counter is that you can make these upgrades immediately following an area's boss fight, not just in the hub. So if you make enough throughout a run, you can just make the upgrades before you die in the next stage, but the amount that you actually need is pretty high, so especially early on, you're more likely to die before you can use them, and if you die, you lose them, so you're not exactly set up to win here. It seems like this was an attempt to recreate Dead Cells' system, where the cells you had would work towards permanent upgrades, which you would do between stages because your cells were lost on death, but the key difference is that Dead Cells let you bank partial progress in those upgrades, so each time you reach the screen, you would make progress, but here it's all or nothing, which means a lot of runs can be wasted. Another counter is the upgrade that lets you keep a certain amount of these materials on death, which does soften that blow, but of course you gotta unlock that with the materials you lose when you die, so fun. At least this is a little bit cheaper than the other upgrades, but even still with this, you lose most of your stuff on death. The last counter, and the one that feels like it's somewhat necessary early on, is to return to the hub upon beating a boss instead of continuing to the next stage, whenever it seems like you have a high probability of death if you continue onwards. Doing so will save all your stuff, but you have to start a fresh new run after that. I kinda hate this because it encourages you to cop out and bounce if you're unsure how you'll fare in the next area instead of convincing you to push yourself. The game is kind of incentivizing you to play it safe, which in my opinion isn't a very fun way to play a game. It's not horrible, but with a few bad breaks maybe tempering your will to push on to later stages when you're low on health, you can maybe get boxed into a cycle of grinding earlier levels, and I don't think that's very satisfying. But to be honest with you, despite the many gripes I do have, most of which are small, one just a little bit bigger, I still really enjoyed this game, and I want to keep putting time into it, not just because of the more positive elements of the gameplay, but because of the real star of the show, the presentation. GetsuFumaDen Undying Moon features both visuals and a soundtrack that feel traditionally Japanese, something that you don't see very often. The only other game with a similar style that comes to mind for me is Okami, which released on the PS2. It actually made me want to do a bit of research, and from what I gathered, the art style of this game seems to derive from the ukiyo-e art movement made popular in the 17th century, a movement that I almost definitely pronounced wrong. A piece that I actually found from that movement was called Mitsukini Defying the Skeleton, and it bears a striking resemblance to the first boss of GetsuFumaDen. Just look at them, they're twins. Despite not being a game with the highest fidelity or the most crisp looking visuals, I do mean what I said in the title. This is probably the most beautiful looking roguelite I've ever played, and that comparison really proves why. This game genuinely looks like Japanese artwork come to life. The backdrops of stages, while not being as densely layered as other side-scrollers, feature a simpler version of the style that makes stages feel like they're overlooking battlefields or raging oceans. With really great details too, like how you can see the first boss in this fiery pit behind you before you make your way to him. The stages are all incredibly different from one another, both in look and and feel. Sometimes you're in interiors with a spooky, ghostly tinge to them. Sometimes the level is more peaceful and open with an oppressive fog that you can ward off. Sometimes everything is fiery and dark, and the enemy design is great. I'm trying not to show too much because I think experiencing the look of this game is a major part of the appeal, but even early on you get these creepy floating heads that lick you to death. I really like these wheel people and these muttering multi-head sorcerers. They all stick out against the background, and of course it all comes to a head with the bosses, who all have a super unique look, great music, and a sizable move set. I loved every single one that I came across, barring one just because I hated the minions around them, but they're a real highlight of the game, and they all have these super quick mood setting intros that end in a sweet ass splash page before you go into battle. Let me just play this one for you in full. That's the first boss, so I saw him over a dozen times, but I still haven't skipped that intro once. It's awesome. The question that I asked myself when making this review and deciding whether or not I would overall recommend this game was, is the gameplay good enough to not drag down this game's incredible presentation? And in the end, I do think the answer is yes. If it didn't have these visuals, this game still would have been fine. I wouldn't have regretted my purchase if I put my money into it, even though I also wouldn't have walked away with too much either. But I can't oversell how much I just liked looking at this game, especially as it gave me more impressive looking areas and creatures. Even the main menu, man, it just makes me want it as a wallpaper. This art style really speaks to me. The solid core building blocks mixed with a handful of good ideas do suffer from some poorly thought out decisions when it comes to the game's progression and some rough edges to the combat, and I spent a good chunk of time discussing those because I do think anyone looking for a masterfully crafted roguelite experience might be disappointed with this offering. But if you're looking to scratch that genre itch, especially on the go with a Switch, even though I personally played this on my PC, and you don't mind a few missteps amidst the new ideas and breathtaking art, then you'll have a really good time with this game. If you are interested in it, you can check it out using the link in my description. Doing so helps my standing on the site where I got the review key, so that would be really helpful. Let me know what your thoughts are on the game. Leave a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.